The Oath and the Abyss. Before the darkness, there was a life of light and purpose. In the archival records of Siet, a bustling town in Transylvania, Hungary, Dr. Gisella Perl's name appears not as a number tattooed on an arm, but as a respected professional. We can almost see the sepia-toned photograph of a life that was, a brilliant student who defied convention to attend medical school in Germany, returning to her hometown to open a thriving gynecology and obstetrics practice. She was a woman of science and healing, bound by the sacred Hippocratic oath to preserve life. Her personal diaries, fragments of which were reconstructed from memory after the war, speak of a fulfilling existence, a beloved husband, also a doctor, a cherished son, loving parents, and a community that relied on her skill and compassion. The year 1943 had been one of tense anxiety for Hungarian Jews, but they remained the last large Jewish community in Europe largely untouched by the machinery of the Holocaust. They lived under the shadow of restrictive laws and anti-Semitism, but the gates of Auschwitz seemed a distant, almost mythical horror. This fragile illusion was shattered on March 19, 1944. On that day, under the codename Operation Margarethi, German forces occupied Hungary. The archival documents from this period are chilling in their clinical precision. Adolf Eichmann, the logistical mastermind of the final solution, arrived in Budapest with his special detachment, and the pace of persecution accelerated with breathtaking speed. The German strategy was one of lightning-fast ghettoization and deportation, a process honed over years in Poland and elsewhere, now unleashed upon a terrified and disoriented population. The economic exploitation was immediate. Jewish property was systematically confiscated, feeding the voracious German war machine. For Dr. Perl and her family, the world shrank in a matter of weeks, from a comfortable home to a crowded, squalid ghetto, a holding pen designed to break their spirit before the final journey. The principles of medicine, of nurturing new life, were about to collide with a force dedicated solely to its extinction. Hello, listener, let me know where you're watching from. And if you don't mind subscribing to the channel and giving it a like, I'd be very pleased as the author. Enjoy listening. The Cattle Car and the Gate of Hell. The journey itself was a weapon. From the testimonies of survivors, including Perl's own detailed account in her book, "I Was a Doctor in Auschwitz," we can reconstruct the horror of the transports. The technology of this part of the genocide was brutally simple: the German Reichsbahn Class 52 Kriegslokomotive steam engine, pulling a long train of windowless cattle cars. These wagons, designed for livestock, were packed with up to 100 human beings for a journey that could last days. There was no food, no water, and only a single bucket for sanitation. The air, thick with the stench of fear, sweat, and excrement, became unbreathable. From an analytical perspective, the transport was the first stage of dehumanization. Stripped of names, possessions, and dignity, crammed together in suffocating darkness, the victims were psychologically broken down, made to feel like the subhumans Nazi ideology proclaimed them to be. Dr. Perl, the physician, was now just another body in the crush. She could do nothing for the dying, the dehydrated, the hysterical. Her medical knowledge was useless against the calculated cruelty of the SS. After 4 agonizing days, the train shuddered to a halt. The doors were wrenched open, flooding the car with blinding light and the sound of guttural shouts and barking dogs. They had arrived at the infamous Judenramp of Auschwitz-Birkenau. The sight that greeted them was a scene from Dante's Inferno, towering searchlights cutting through the night, the acrid smell of burning flesh hanging heavy in the air, and the ominous silhouette of brick chimneys belching a constant, dirty smoke. In the distance stood a gatehouse, the Gate of Hell, through which the train tracks passed, signifying a point of no return. The logistics of arrival were a terrifying spectacle of order and chaos, with SS guards directing the human torrent towards a figure standing calmly amidst the bedlam, a man who held the power of life and death in a single flick of his white-gloved hand. Selection and the Shadow of Mengele. This was the selection. It was the tactical centerpiece of Auschwitz's extermination process, a chillingly efficient method of separating those fit for slave labor from those condemned to immediate death in the gas chambers. The strategy was twofold. First, to extract maximum economic value from the able-bodied prisoners for the Reich's war effort, working them to death in munitions factories and construction projects. Second, to liquidate the useless eaters, the old, the sick, the very young, and their mothers, with maximum speed. Presiding over this infernal sorting on the ramp was SS Hauptsturmführer Dr. Josef Mengele. Archival photographs and survivor testimonies paint a consistent and terrifying portrait. He was not a frothing, monstrous brute. He was impeccably dressed in a freshly pressed SS uniform, his boots polished to a mirror shine, often humming an opera tune. This veneer of cultured civility made his actions all the more grotesque. He was the Angel of Death, a title earned by the casual, almost bored manner in which he directed thousands to their doom. As Dr. Perl was herded forward with her family, the moment of separation arrived. Her husband was shoved to one side, her son and parents to the other. She would never see them again. When her turn came, amidst the screaming and chaos, someone shouted, "She is a doctor. A gynecologist." Mengele's head turned. His gaze, a cold, analytical curiosity, fell upon her. A flicker of interest. In a place where a person's profession was meaningless, hers had just saved her life. Mengele needed doctors. He needed skilled hands for his own monstrous purposes in the camp's infirmary. With a flick of his riding crop, Perl was sent to the line of the living, marked for a fate that was, in many ways, more torturous than immediate death. She had been chosen by the devil himself to work in his laboratory. The infirmary of horrors, the Revier. Dr. Perl was taken to Block 10 in Auschwitz and later to the infirmary, or Revier, in the women's camp of Birkenau, Camp BIIC. This was a perverse parody of a medical facility. The structure was a standard wooden barracks, identical to the ones housing other prisoners, drafty and infested with vermin. Inside, there were no beds, only three-tiered wooden bunks crammed with the sick and dying. From a logistical standpoint, the Revier was not designed for healing. It was designed to manage the camp's labor pool. Its primary function was to quarantine infectious diseases to prevent epidemics that could halt war production, and to provide a place for prisoners too weak to work to either recover quickly or die. The medical equipment was a collection of horrors. There were no antibiotics, no anesthetics, no antiseptics, and almost no bandages. A single roll of crepe paper was used as a universal dressing for festering wounds, boils, and surgical incisions. Thermometers were a rarity, often broken. Surgical instruments, when available, were unsterilized, used on one patient after another. The human factor within this system was a complex tragedy. The prisoner doctors and nurses, like Perl, were caught in an impossible bind. They were desperate to provide comfort and care, yet they presided over a system of death. Every day, SS doctors like Mengele or Fritz Klein would sweep through the barracks for their own selections. Anyone deemed too sick to recover was marked for the gas chambers. The infirmary, therefore, became both a sanctuary and a death trap, and the prisoner doctors were forced to become its gatekeepers, making horrific triage decisions about who might have a chance to live and who was already condemned. The devil's assignment. It was in this nightmare world that Dr. Gisella Perl received her official assignment directly from the architect of her damnation, Josef Mengele. He summoned her, his demeanor a chilling mix of professional courtesy and absolute menace. As she stood before him, he laid out her duties. She would be the gynecologist for the women's camp. She was to care for the female prisoners, treating their myriad ailments from starvation-induced infections to injuries from brutal beatings. But then came the core of his directive, delivered with cold, emotionless clarity. He pointed toward the smoking chimneys of the crematoria. In this camp, Mengele stated, it is a crime for a Jewish woman to be pregnant. He explained the logic with perverse rationality. A pregnant woman could not perform the hard labor demanded of her. A newborn child was a useless mouth to feed and, more importantly, represented the continuation of the Jewish race that the Third Reich was dedicated to eradicating. Therefore, the camp's policy was absolute. Any woman found to be pregnant was subject to the most horrific tortures for Mengele's research before being sent, along with her unborn child, to the gas chamber. Mengele's final order to Perl was unequivocal: you are to report every pregnant woman to me immediately. The weight of this command was crushing. The Hippocratic Oath, the core of her identity, demanded she protect life, especially the nascent life of the unborn. Now, she was being ordered to become a fingerwoman, an informant whose medical diagnosis would be a direct death sentence. As she left Mengel's presence, the infernal calculus of her situation became clear. To obey Mengele was to become a murderer. To disobey him would mean her own death, and the death of the woman she tried to hide. She was trapped, a doctor in a world where healing was a crime and salvation could only be found in the most desperate and heartbreaking of acts. The first secret. The weight of Mengele's directive settled upon Dr. Perl not as a choice, but as a suffocating certainty of doom. Back in the lice-infested squalor of the Birkenau infirmary, the theoretical horror of his order quickly became a devastating reality. Her first test came within days. A young woman, her face a mask of terror, was brought to her. She was skeletal, like all the others, but a slight, almost imperceptible roundness to her lower abdomen betrayed her secret. In the pre-war world, this would have been a moment for gentle confirmation and joyful counsel. In Auschwitz, it was a death sentence. The archival records of prisoner testimonies are filled with such moments of quiet, desperate exchange, where a single glance could mean life or death. The young woman's eyes, wide with fear, pleaded with Perl. She didn't need to speak the words. She knew the camp's iron law. Dr. Perl's mind raced through the terrible options. She could follow Mengele's order. A single word to an SS guard, a notation in a ledger, and the woman would be gone within the hour, dragged to Block 10 for experimentation or sent directly to Crematorium 4. Perl would be safe, for a time. Or she could lie, claim the woman had a tumor, and try to hide her. But for how long? The physical changes of pregnancy would soon become undeniable, not just to her, but to the capos and block supervisors who were always watching, eager to curry favor with the SS. Discovery would mean the most brutal death for them both. It was in that moment, looking at the terrified face of another human being whose only crime was the creation of life, that Dr. Perl made her decision. The Hippocratic Oath, in this inverted moral universe, required a radical reinterpretation. First, do no harm, the oath states. The greatest harm she could do was to obey the camp's logic. The only way to do no harm to the mother standing before her was to sacrifice the unborn child. She would not be Mengele's informant. She would become a different kind of angel in this hell, one who delivered a terrible, secret mercy. A terrible mercy, performed in darkness. Having made her vow of defiance, Dr. Perl now faced a monumental medical and logistical challenge. How could she terminate a pregnancy in a place with no tools, no sanitation, and no privacy? The technology of life-saving was absent, replaced by the technology of death. There were no surgical suites, only the filth-ridden floor of a barracks. No sterilized scalpels, only her own hands. No anesthesia to dull the pain, only a piece of soiled rag for the woman to bite on. Her memoir, corroborated by other survivors, describes the procedure with harrowing clarity. She would wait until the deepest hours of the night, when the guards were less vigilant and the barracks were cloaked in a semblance of quiet. The pregnant woman would be brought to a corner, shielded by a few loyal prisoner nurses who formed a human wall, their bodies blocking the view from prying eyes. The only light was often the faint glimmer of the moon through a crack in the wooden wall. With nothing but her bare hands, her deep knowledge of female anatomy, and a desperate prayer, Dr. Perl would perform the abortions. It was brutal, agonizing work. Without instruments, she had to dilate the cervix manually, a process of excruciating pain for the patient. She then had to break the amniotic sac and remove the fetus. The risk of hemorrhage and infection was astronomical. In any normal medical context, this would be malpractice of the highest order. But in Auschwitz, it was an act of profound love and radical preservation. Every successful, secret termination was a victory. It was a life, the mother's, stolen back from the gas chambers. She destroyed the evidence, disposed of the fetal remains in the camp's latrines, and sent the woman back to her bunk, weak and bleeding, but alive. She had spared her the fate of becoming another one of Mengele's research subjects, spared her the horror of watching her newborn baby be thrown onto a fire or drowned in a bucket, as was common practice. It was a sin, a crime against her oath, but it was the only way to save a life. The conspiracy of healers. Dr. Perl's secret war could not be waged alone. A single act of defiance was one thing. A sustained campaign of saving hundreds of women required a network of absolute trust in a place designed to shatter all human bonds. The social structure of the camp was a complex web of terror and survival. At the bottom were the Muselmänner, the walking dead who had given up all hope. Above them were the ordinary prisoners. And then there were the Prominenten, prisoners with privileged jobs, block supervisors, blockhaltists, clerks, Schreiber, and capos, who held power over others. Many of these functionaries were brutal, collaborating with the SS to save their own skins. But some, a precious few, used their positions to resist. Dr. Perl's operation depended on identifying and recruiting these silent conspirators. Her closest allies were the prisoner nurses who worked alongside her in the Revier. These women, many of them medically trained, became her lookouts, her assistants, her co-conspirators. They learned to spot the signs of early pregnancy and would discreetly guide the women to Perl. They would steal rags for bandages and stand guard during the clandestine procedures. The logistical challenge of hiding these acts from the meticulous German bureaucracy was immense. Every prisoner was a number, their status tracked on cards. A woman admitted to the infirmary needed a diagnosis. A sudden miscarriage or uterine hemorrhage, if it happened too often, would raise suspicion. This is where the prisoner clerks became vital. A trusted clerk could lose a file, alter a diagnosis from hemorrhage to dysentery, or falsify a date. It was a war fought with ink and paper, a dangerous game of bureaucratic sabotage played under the very noses of the SS. One slip, one betrayal by a jealous capo or a desperate informant hoping for an extra piece of bread, would bring the entire network crashing down, leading everyone involved to the torture cells of Block 11. Witness to Mengel's madness. To understand the sheer necessity of Dr. Perl's horrific choice, one must look at the alternative she fought to prevent. Her work brought her into regular, horrifying contact with Josef Mengele and his pseudo-scientific depravity. She was a direct witness to the atrocities that awaited any pregnant woman who was discovered. From declassified trial documents and her own testimony at Nuremberg, a clear picture of Mengele's research emerges. He was obsessed with genetics, particularly with twins and individuals with congenital abnormalities. But his interest in pregnant women was equally sadistic. He would have them brought to his experimental block, where he would subject them to a battery of torturous examinations. He drew their blood repeatedly, measured every part of their bodies, and documented their slow starvation. He would then allow them to deliver their babies. Perl was sometimes forced to assist. What happened next was the stuff of nightmares. She witnessed Mengele ordering a young mother's breasts to be bound tightly with cloth, preventing her from breastfeeding. He wanted to time precisely how long it would take for the newborn to starve to death, while the mother, tormented by her child's cries, went slowly insane. In other cases, newborns were used for vivisection, their organs examined without anesthesia. Some were drowned in buckets of cold water, others were injected with lethal pathogens to see how they would react. This was not science, it was the unhinged pursuit of racial ideology through torture, performed by a man with absolute power and no empathy. Every time Dr. Perl secretly ended a pregnancy in the dark, she saw the faces of these murdered babies and their tortured mothers. She was not destroying a life, she was preventing a grotesque and public spectacle of suffering, cheating the angel of death of his prize. The healer's scars. The physical toll of Auschwitz was evident on every prisoner's emaciated body. But for Dr. Gisella Perl, the deepest wounds were invisible, carved into her very soul. Each of the estimated 3,000 abortions she performed was a separate trauma, a direct violation of the creed she had sworn to uphold. In her memoir, she describes the profound psychological conflict. She was a gynecologist, a bringer of life, now forced to become its destroyer to save it. She referred to her hands, the instruments of so much healing in her former life, as the hands of a murderer. She was haunted by the silent screams of the women she operated on in the dark, and by the ghosts of the unborn children who would never draw breath. The burden of her secret was immense. During the day, she had to maintain a facade of compliance, interacting with SS doctors and guards, feigning ignorance when Mengele inquired about pregnancies. At night, she performed her grim work, and in the few moments of rest she had, she was tormented by what she had done. This was the ultimate human cost of her resistance. To survive and to help others survive, she had to dismantle a part of her own identity. The joy she once found in her profession was replaced with a deep, abiding sorrow. She was saving lives, yes, but the method forced upon her by the perverted logic of the camp was a constant source of self-recrimination. She was a hero, but she could never see herself as one. She was a healer who was forced to wound, a savior who felt like a sinner. These internal scars, the profound moral injury of her time in Auschwitz, would follow her long after the barbed wire was torn down and the crematoria fell silent. The war on sickness. While the secret abortions formed the terrifying core of Dr. Perl's resistance, her daily battle was a relentless war against the diseases that festered in the fertile ground of starvation and filth. Auschwitz was a perfect incubator for epidemics. The tactical decision by the SS to cram thousands of malnourished people into unheated, unhygienic barracks created a public health crisis that, ironically, threatened the very slave labor force the Reich sought to exploit. Archival medical records from the camp, though sparse and often falsified, combined with survivor testimonies, list a horrifying litany of ailments: typhus, spread by the ubiquitous lice that infested every seam of clothing, scarlet fever, dysentery, which turned the latrines into pits of death, and widespread skin infections like scabies and boils. Dr. Perl, as one of the few skilled physicians, was on the front lines of this biological warfare. Her medical equipment was a tragic joke. To diagnose scarlet fever, she had no lab, she relied on spotting the characteristic strawberry tongue. To fight infection, she had no sulfa drugs, she was forced to use her bare hands to squeeze pus from abscesses, a procedure that was both agonizing for the patient and dangerous for her. The SS approach was schizophrenically pragmatic. They feared a full-blown typhus epidemic that could halt production at the nearby IG Farben munitions plant, so they would periodically conduct delousing actions, forcing prisoners to stand naked for hours in the freezing cold while their barracks were sprayed with Zyklon B, the same gas used in the extermination chambers. For Dr. Perl, this meant engaging in a desperate form of preventative medicine. She taught the women around her the importance of using their meager water ration for washing, of picking lice from each other's hair, and of isolating those with fevers as best they could. It was a near impossible task, a desperate attempt to impose the logic of hygiene onto a system designed for decay, a constant, draining fight to save lives not just from the gas, but from the slow, agonizing death of disease. The phantom economy of Canada. In the midst of total deprivation, a strange and sophisticated black market economy thrived within Auschwitz, and Dr. Perl's ability to save lives often depended on her navigating this treacherous system. The heart of this economy was a section of the camp known sarcastically by the prisoners as Canada, a place of unimaginable riches. It consisted of several dozen barracks where the plundered belongings of the millions of murdered Jews were sorted. From an economic perspective, this was the Reich's central depot for stolen wealth. Mountains of clothes, shoes, jewelry, currency, and food were processed by a special prisoner detachment, the Aufräumungskommando, before being shipped back to Germany. For the prisoners, however, Canada was a source of life. The commandos working there, at great personal risk, would smuggle items out, creating a current of contraband that flowed through the camp. A diamond ring stolen from a sorting table could be traded to a corrupt SS guard for a loaf of bread. A jar of marmalade could buy protection from a capo. For Dr. Perl, this phantom economy was a vital lifeline. Her network of conspirators would use whatever they had, a whispered promise, a piece of stolen information, to barter for critical supplies. A single, clean steel needle, organized from a guard who had taken it from a murdered tailor's luggage, was worth more than gold. It meant she could suture a wound without causing a fatal infection. A small bottle of aspirin, smuggled from the SS dispensary, could mean the difference between life and death for someone with a raging fever. Dr. Perl's most precious asset was her medical skill. She would perform services for privileged prisoners or even capos, lancing a boil, treating a venereal disease, in exchange for a bit of real food for a starving patient, a cleaner rag for a bandage, or, most importantly, a moment of willful blindness from a supervisor while she attended to another pregnant woman. This was the grim marketplace of Auschwitz, where life was the ultimate currency, and a doctor's expertise was a commodity to be bartered for survival itself. A birth in secret, a life in moments. In the midst of the nearly 3,000 lives Dr. Perl was forced to end before they began, one extraordinary and heartbreaking story stands out in her testimony, a testament to the unquenchable human instinct for motherhood. A young woman had somehow managed to conceal her pregnancy until she went into labor. To bring her to the infirmary was impossible, she would be killed on the spot. Instead, under the cover of night, Dr. Perl and her assistants turned a corner of the upper bunk of a barracks into a makeshift delivery room. While other women coughed and groaned to cover the mother's cries of pain, Perl delivered a healthy baby boy. The logistical challenge of hiding a newborn in a place with zero privacy was immense. The baby, incredibly, seemed to understand. He rarely cried. The mother, skeletal and weak, had no milk, so the other women in the block conspired to save him. They would sacrifice their own meager bread rations, chewing them into a soft pulp to feed the infant. For 8 precious weeks, this tiny life was the block's collective secret, a small flicker of warmth and hope in the coldest place on earth. He was passed from woman to woman, kept hidden under filthy blankets, a symbol of life's defiance. But in Auschwitz, hope was a dangerous contraband. The baby was eventually discovered by an SS guard during a surprise inspection. Without a word, the guard picked him up, took him outside, and killed him. The mother was taken away, never to be seen again. This single, devastating event reinforced the brutal truth that drove Dr. Perl's terrible mission. She had allowed one life to begin, and the system had snuffed it out with casual cruelty. The memory of that healthy baby boy, and the agonizing futility of his brief existence, became the ultimate justification for her actions. It proved, beyond any doubt, that in Auschwitz, the only mercy she could offer a new life was to prevent it from ever starting. The rising smoke in the Red Army's shadow. By the autumn of 1944, the strategic landscape of the war had shifted dramatically. On the Eastern Front, the relentless advance of the Red Army was undeniable. The sounds of distant artillery fire could sometimes be heard on the wind, a terrifying and hopeful rumble. For the SS, the approaching Soviets triggered not surrender, but a final, homicidal frenzy. The order came down from Himmler himself: eliminate all evidence of the final solution. This meant accelerating the pace of killing to an insane degree. The archival data shows that the period from May to November 1944 was the most lethal in Auschwitz's history, primarily due to the arrival and extermination of the Hungarian Jews. Now, in the camp's final months, the goal was to liquidate the remaining prisoners and dismantle the machinery of death. The 4 massive crematoria of Birkenau worked day and night, their chimneys belching a constant, thick, greasy smoke that blotted out the sun and coated everything in a layer of human ash. The stench of burning bodies was overwhelming, a constant, inescapable reminder of the industrial-scale slaughter. This final paroxysm of violence even led to a singular, desperate act of rebellion. On October 7, 1944, the Sonderkommando, the Jewish prisoners forced to work in the gas chambers and crematoria, rose up, using smuggled explosives to destroy Crematorium 4. The revolt was crushed with predictable brutality. For Dr. Perl and the women in her care, this was a time of ultimate dread. The selections became more frequent and more arbitrary. Anyone who looked too weak was immediately condemned. Her secret work became even more frantic and perilous. Every woman she saved from pregnancy was one less body for the overstrained crematoria, one less ghost to rise in the blackening sky, a final, desperate act of defiance as the world's most notorious death camp consumed itself in a last eruption of fire and ash. The last selection and the march into nothingness. On January 18, 1945, the end came, not as liberation, but as a new form of organized chaos. With Soviet tanks just a few miles away, the final order was given: evacuate Auschwitz. This triggered the last selection. SS guards stormed through the barracks, including the Revier, shouting and beating prisoners out of their bunks. This was not a selection for the gas chambers, but for a forced march. The tactical decision was clear. The Reich still needed slave labor for its subterranean factories, and Himmler was determined not to leave behind living witnesses to his crimes. Those too sick or weak to walk were to be left behind, and most were summarily executed by SS cleanup squads. Dr. Perl, gaunt but still standing after 10 months in hell, was herded with tens of thousands of others out of the main gate, past the infamous Arbeit macht frei sign. This was the beginning of the Death March. The logistical planning was non-existent, a deliberate strategy of extermination through exposure, starvation, and exhaustion. Clad in their striped prison rags in the brutal Polish winter, the columns of prisoners were force-marched west, away from the advancing Soviets. The guards were merciless, shooting anyone who stumbled or could not keep up. The roads became littered with frozen corpses. For Gisella Perl, leaving the gates of Auschwitz was not an escape. It was merely an exchange of one circle of hell for another. She was leaving behind the relative structure of the camp, its infirmary, her network, the grim but familiar routine, for the utter lawlessness of the road. She was no longer Dr. Perl, the camp gynecologist. She was just another anonymous, shuffling figure in a column of the damned, marching towards an unknown destination, her survival once again reduced to the next step, the next breath, and the biting winter wind. From the fire to the ice. The death march from Auschwitz was a tactical retreat for the SS and a mobile form of genocide for the prisoners. Stripped of the industrial efficiency of the gas chambers, the strategy reverted to a more primitive cruelty, death by nature and neglect. The archival meteorological data for Poland in January 1945 shows temperatures plummeting far below freezing, with heavy snowfall. For the prisoners, clad only in thin, striped uniforms and often without shoes, this was a death sentence. Dr. Perl, already skeletal, was propelled forward by the primal instinct to survive. In her memoirs, she recounts the landscape of the march, a white, frozen hell punctuated by the black shapes of bodies left where they fell. The sharp crack of an SS officer's pistol was the constant soundtrack to their suffering, a percussive reminder that any sign of weakness was fatal. Even in this state of near-total collapse, her physician's instincts remained. She could do little, but she tried. She instructed women near her to huddle together for warmth, to eat snow to combat dehydration, to rub their frozen limbs to stave off frostbite. After weeks of this agonizing trek, the depleted column of survivors arrived at another concentration camp, Bergen-Belsen, in northern Germany. This was not a transfer to a better place. It was a descent into a new kind of hell. Belsen was not an extermination camp with gas chambers, but by 1945, it had become an overcrowded, disease-ridden dumping ground for prisoners evacuated from camps across the East. There was virtually no food, no water, and a typhus epidemic was raging unchecked. The camp's infrastructure had completely collapsed. For Perl, it was a transition from the organized brutality of Auschwitz to the utter chaos of a dying society. She had escaped Mengel's shadow only to be thrown into a pit of contagion and starvation, where the dead lay unburied among the living. Liberation in the face of apathy. On April 15, 1945, the war ended for Gisella Perl. It did not end with a triumphant charge or a joyous cheer, but with the rumble of British tanks crushing the perimeter fence of Bergen-Belsen. The soldiers of the British 11th Armored Division were hardened combat veterans, but nothing could have prepared them for what they found. The archival footage shot by the British Army Film and Photographic Unit that day remains one of history's most shocking documents. It shows mountains of emaciated, unburied corpses and, moving among them, skeletal figures whom the soldiers first mistook for ghosts. There were 60,000 living prisoners in the camp, most of them suffering from typhus, dysentery, and advanced starvation. For Dr. Perl and the other survivors, liberation was an abstract concept. They were too weak, too sick, too psychologically shattered to comprehend it. This phenomenon, known as liberation trauma, is well documented. After years of sustained terror, the sudden removal of the threat did not lead to relief, but to a profound state of apathy and disorientation. The mind, conditioned for constant survival, could not process the shift to safety. Perl, the doctor who had fought so hard to keep others alive, was now a patient herself, weighing less than 70 pounds and suffering from typhus. She collapsed, barely conscious, as the British medical units, themselves overwhelmed by the logistical nightmare of the situation, began the monumental task of burying the dead and trying to save the living. The irony was devastating. Having survived the SS, thousands of prisoners died in the days and weeks after liberation, their bodies too ravaged by disease and starvation to recover. For Gisella Perl, the end of the war was not a celebration of life, but a blur of fever dreams in a field hospital, surrounded by the sights and sounds of death that had followed her out of the camps. The weight of freedom, the accusation of guilt. In the months that followed, as her body slowly began to heal in a convent repurposed as a recovery center, the true weight of her freedom descended. The physical liberation from the camps was replaced by a psychological imprisonment of grief. Word slowly trickled in through survivor networks and Red Cross lists. Her husband, her son, her parents, her entire extended family, all murdered. She was utterly alone in the world, the sole survivor of a once vibrant family. The immensity of this loss, combined with the guilt and trauma of her experiences, was unbearable. In her darkest moment, she attempted to end her own life with poison. She was found and saved, but her ordeal was far from over. A new, insidious torment emerged from the community of survivors itself. In a world desperate for clear heroes and villains, Dr. Perl's story was dangerously ambiguous. Whispers began to circulate. She was Mengele's assistant. She had worked in the infirmary. She had performed abortions. To some who had not witnessed the daily calculus of the Revere and did not understand the impossible choices she faced, her survival and her role were suspect. They saw the what, the abortions, the proximity to SS doctors, but could not comprehend the why. She was accused of collaboration, of being complicit in the Nazi machine. This accusation struck at the very heart of her moral injury. The actions she had taken, the sins she had committed in her own mind to save lives, were now being used by others to condemn her. She was a hero who was being branded a traitor, a savior who was being called a murderer by the very people she had sought to protect. This painful misunderstanding ignited in her a new, fierce determination. She had to bear witness. She had to explain the inexplicable. She had to tell the world the truth of Auschwitz, not just for justice, but for her own vindication. The witness stand and the written word. Her journey to vindication was a global one. After being cleared by Allied authorities who investigated her actions and recognized their true nature, Dr. Perl was encouraged to share her testimony. In 1947, she made her way to New York, sponsored by the Hungarian-American community. There, she was interviewed by the U.S. government. Her detailed, first-hand account of Josef Mengele's experiments, the functions of the infirmary, and the systematic extermination process was a bombshell. From an intelligence and legal perspective, her testimony was pure gold. She was not just a victim, she was a professional medical witness who could articulate the scientific and procedural realities of the genocide with chilling precision. Her words helped paint a comprehensive portrait of the angel of death for the investigators and Nazi hunters who would pursue him for decades. But speaking to officials in closed rooms was not enough. To reclaim her narrative and honor the dead, she had to speak to the world. In 1948, she published her memoir, I Was a Doctor in Auschwitz. The book was a raw, unflinching, and deeply personal account of her ordeal. It was her archival record, her final report, her confession, and her defense all in one. In its pages, she laid bare the horror of Mengele's directive and the soul-destroying logic that forced her to perform the 3,000 abortions. The book was a radical act of truth-telling, forcing a post-war world that wanted to move on to confront the moral abyss of the camps and to understand that survival itself was often an act of profound and painful compromise. Through her testimony and her writing, she ceased to be the accused and became what she truly was, one of the Holocaust's most vital and courageous witnesses. A legacy of 3,000 lives. Despite her crucial testimony, Dr. Perl's fight was not over. She faced a difficult battle with U.S. immigration authorities, who, fueled by the initial accusations of collaboration, were hesitant to grant her citizenship. It took the intervention of prominent figures, including Eleanor Roosevelt, to finally secure her status. Then, at the age of 44, Gisella Perl decided to reclaim the one thing the Nazis had tried to destroy forever, her identity as a healer. She passed the American Medical Board exams and, in 1951, opened a gynecology practice in New York City. Her past was not something she hid, it became the source of a unique and profound empathy. She chose to specialize in infertility. The woman who had been forced by a monster to terminate pregnancies now dedicated her life to helping women who desperately wanted children. A beautiful, almost mythical symmetry began to unfold in her new life. As she built her practice at Mount Sinai Hospital, she became a renowned expert, a source of hope for countless couples. By the time of her retirement, Dr. Gisella Perl, the angel of Auschwitz, had delivered an estimated 3,000 healthy babies into the world. The number was an uncanny echo of the 3,000 lives she had been forced to end in the darkness of the barracks. It was as if, through this final, extraordinary chapter, she had balanced the scales of her soul. She had reclaimed her hands, transforming them from instruments of a terrible, necessary mercy back into instruments of joy and creation. Her legacy is thus twofold, a harrowing testament to the depths of human cruelty, and an even more powerful testament to the capacity of the human spirit not just to endure, but to heal, to rebuild, and to defiantly create life in the very shadow of death.